Welcome to another episode of Historical's full documentary video series. Today, we will discuss in detail an important event in medieval history, which directly involved religion, politics, military strategy, real religious fervor, but also real greed and personal ambition. Join us in this episode as we recount the First Crusade, a profound event that shaped the course of history. In the 11th century AD, the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean were troubled by conflicting interests. The kings and generals of Western Europe set their sights on Jerusalem, the holy city of the three major Abrahamic religions. But this was no ordinary military campaign. It was a complex, multifaceted, and multinational effort, which included famous personalities from all over Europe, whose leadership, bravery, determination, and intelligence were going to be tested. In this episode, we will analyze the complex geopolitical landscape, describe the key figures who led the Crusades, account of key battles and the military tactics used in those battles and their outcomes. For control of the Holy Land, not only history will be told, but historical misconceptions will also be examined. So let's begin our discussion about the First Crusade. Background. During the century following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, Muslim forces conquered Jerusalem and the Levant, including the territories of present-day Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and Israel, North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula, including present-day Syria. Spain, Portugal, and France were included, all of which were formerly under Roman Christian rule. Until the 11th century, Christians continued to challenge this Islamic occupation in one way or another, but they could never capture the Holy Land, Jerusalem. The First Crusade was Christendom's reaction against the expansion of Islam into the Byzantine Empire by the Fatimids and Seljukes. In Western Europe, Jerusalem was considered worthy of penitential pilgrimages. While the grip of the Seljukes on Jerusalem had weakened at that time, the Fatimids later captured the city. Pilgrims returning to Europe exaggerated the false reports of the persecution of Christians and their co-religionists, presented the Byzantine forces, which were collapsing before the Seljuk Empire, began to gather to their aid the Western European warrior class. Their co-religionists under the papal military command. The second reason for this war was economic. Throughout Europe by the 11th century, the population of Europe had greatly increased, because technological and agricultural innovations allowed trade to flourish. The Catholic Church had become a dominant influence on Western civilization. Society was organized by a feudal political structure, whereby landlords and nobles rented their lands and fiefs and provided their subjects. For military service to their rulers, because it was becoming difficult to pay the salaries of these soldiers. The third reason for this crusade was the Gregorian reform movement, which led to conflict with the Eastern Christians. Its influence increased during the period 1050–1080 AD. This movement was rooted in the doctrine of papal supremacy. The Eastern Church saw the Pope as only one member of the 5 patriarchs of the Church, the others being Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. I was encouraged to send a league to Seljukes, which ended in mutual excommunication and the schism and division of the Eastern and Western churches. Subsequently, a theory of holy war developed, dating from the works of the 4th century theologian Augustine of Hippo. Augustine wrote that aggressive war is a sin, but war can be justified when a king or bishop declares it, either defensively or for the recovery of occupied lands, and in don't involve too much violence. Meanwhile, the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in Western Europe gave birth to a warrior race, which had nothing to do but fight among themselves. Violent actions were used to resolve even minor disputes, so the papacy devised a plan to reduce these disputes. So, Pope Alexander II drew up an oath, which began conscription, which Gregory VII spread throughout Europe. These soldiers were prepared by the Church for the ongoing Christian conflicts with the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula, especially Spain and the Norman conquest of Sicily. Gregory VII went further in 1074. He planned a show of military power, taking advantage of papal sovereignty, in a holy war to support the ongoing Byzantine wars against the Seljukes. But he failed to gather the necessary support. Luke's theologian Anselm took a decisive step toward an authentic Crusader doctrine, declaring that fighting for righteous causes could lead to forgiveness of sins from God. Battle of Malazigirit, 1071 AD. The Battle of Malazigirit or Malazigirit was fought on 26 August 1071 between the Seljuk Turks and the Byzantine Empire. This battle is of great importance as it had profound effects on the destinies of both empires. The Seljuk Turks advanced into Byzantine lands to expand their empire, while the Byzantine Empire failed to defend itself due to its political and military weakness. The Seljuk forces were led by their brave and experienced Sultan, Alp Arslan, while the Byzantine forces were led by Romanos IV. This battle took place in present-day Turkey. And extended them further into Anatolia. An opportunity to step in was provided, while the Byzantine Empire suffered heavy losses. This was the only time in history that a Byzantine emperor became a prisoner of a Muslim commander. After this battle, the arrival of Turkic tribes and their occupation of Byzantine lands paved the way for the Ottoman Empire to be founded. This event of the victory of Malazigirit is considered to be one of the important events of the foundation of the First Crusade. In 95, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon at Clermont that led to the start of the Crusades. He declared war for the liberation of Palestine for the Christian people and spoke of helping the losing Byzantine Empire. The victory at the Battle of Malazigirit paved the way for the invasion of Europe by the Seljuk Turks and exposed the weakness of the Byzantine Empire. This situation became a major impetus for the Crusades movement, which later gave the Christians an opportunity to advance towards the east. Pope Urban II's call for holy war at Clermont drew an enthusiastic and popular response from all social classes in Western Europe. Thousands, mostly poor Christians, began to gather under the leadership of a French priest, Peter the Hermit. Hence it is known as the People's Crusade. These forces departed from Europe in the late summer of 1096. and arrived in Constantinople between November and April of the following year. They took various routes to Constantinople, some through Eastern Europe and through the Balkans, some crossed the Adriatic Sea. Along the way, they passed through Germany, and widespread massacres of Jews were carried out by these crusaders, the most famous being the Rhineland massacre. They were received with displeasure in Constantinople. These forces included the southern French forces under Raymond IV of Toulouse and Lepieu's nobles, warriors from Upper and Lower Lorraine, led by Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Baldwin. The Italian Norman forces, led by Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred. Also included were various North French and Flemish forces under Robert Curthose of Normandy, Stephen of Blois, Hugh of Vermandois, and Robert II of Flanders. Estimates of the size of the Crusaders range from 70,000 to 80,000. There are those who left Western Europe a year after Clermont, and joined it over a period of 3 years. Estimates of the number of knights range from 7,000 to 10,000, 35,000 to 50,000 infantry, and a total of 60,000 to 100,000 including non-combatants. The Christian volunteers at each halt roused the great army by their fiery speeches, and besides taking the oath from them, were given a cross, which was usually sewn on their clothes. Nationalist Christian forces began to advance towards Asia Minor or Anatolia. On the other hand, the condition of the Seljuk Empire, which was considered powerful in its time, was that after the death of Nizam-ul-Mulk, the able administrator of the Seljuk Empire in the year 1092, the death of Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah and Fatimid Caliph al-Mustanzar Billah took place soon. After Malik Shah's death, Calais Arslan, the ruler of Anatolia and the conquered territories of the Roman Empire, while his brother Tutush, one in Syria, started a civil war against his brother Barkiyaruk to become sultan. When Tutush was killed in 1095, his sons Rizwan and Dakak inherited the rulership of Aleppo and Damascus respectively, while Qawm al-Dawla Karboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, received the Emirate of Mosul. Thus the country of Syria was divided between them. Most of Egypt and Palestine were controlled by the Fatimids under the nominal rule of the Fatimid Caliph, al-Musta Ali. But their actual control was with Wazir al-Afdal Shansha. In 1073 AD, the Fatimids took Jerusalem from the Seljukes, but in 1098, the Seljukes were able to recapture the city. After entering Asia Minor or Anatolia, the Crusaders, taking advantage of the confusion and division of the Seljuks, split into separate factions, massacred the population, and began plundering the countryside. Zigai of Nicaea. The Crusaders entered Asia Minor during the first half of 1097, where they were joined by the zealous priest, Peter the Hermit, and the rest of his relatively small army. In addition, the Roman Emperor Alexios also sent 2 of his generals to help the Crusaders. The first target of their campaign was Nicaea, which had once been a city under Byzantine rule, but had now become the capital of the Seljuk Empire of Rome under Caliph Arslan. Arslan was then on a campaign against Denmark in central Anatolia, and had left his treasure and his family behind, underestimating the strength of these new crusaders. Upon the arrival of the Crusaders in May 1097, the city was besieged, and Arslan, when he heard of it, returned to Nicaea and attacked the Crusaders on 16 May. He was repulsed by an unexpectedly large Crusader force, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides of the battle. The siege continued, but the Crusaders had little success. as they realized that they were outnumbered. Cannot blockade the lake on which the city was situated and from which it was supplied with water. To sack the city, Alexios drove the Crusader ships ashore on logs, and upon seeing them, the Turkish army finally surrendered on June 18th. Battle of Dorylaeum. In late June, the Crusaders advanced into Anatolia. They were accompanied by some Byzantine troops under Titicius, a general of the Emperor Alexios, and still hoped that Alexios would send a further Byzantine force to support them. They divided the army into two more organized groups, one led by the Normans, the other by the French. The two groups planned to meet again at Dorylaeum, but on 1 July the Normans, outnumbered by the French, were ambushed at Clige Arslan. Arslan had surrounded Norman Zaku with his fast-mounted archers. The Normans took up a strong defensive formation and quickly marched to the aid of the French. When the French arrived, Godfrey attacked the Turks from the outside, while the Normans attacked from the inside, forcing the Seljukes to flee. After that, the Crusaders' march through Anatolia continued unopposed. But the journey was unpleasant. As Clige Arslan had destroyed the crops, water, and food reserves within his empire, so that the Crusaders could not use them. It was midsummer, and the Crusaders had little food and water was very low. Many men and horses died. The local Christians sometimes gave them gifts of food and money, but the Crusaders plundered and massacred these populations whenever they got the chance. Their overall leadership was not strong enough to command and maintain discipline on their own. Armenian Interval. After passing through the Silesian gates, Baldwin and Tancred separated from the main command of the army and headed for Armenian territory. Baldwin wanted to build a fiefdom for himself in the Holy Land, and in Armenia he could count on the support of the natives, especially an adventurer named Bagrat. Baldwin and Tancred set out from Heraclea on September 15th, leading two separate armies. Tancred first reached Tarsus, where he captured a fortress from the Seljuk army. Baldwin reached Tarsus the next day and captured part of the fortress. Soon after, a group of Norman warriors arrived, but Baldwin refused them entry to the castle. The Turks slaughtered the Normans during the night. In response, Baldwin's men blamed him for the Normans' deaths. Baldwin took refuge in a tower and assured his soldiers of his innocence. Tancred, in the meantime, captured the town of Malmstra. Baldwin reached the city about September 30th. The Norman Richard of Salerno wanted revenge for Tarsus, which led to a clash between Baldwin's and Tancred's soldiers. Baldwin left Malmstra and joined the Central Army at Marash, but Bagrat persuaded him to start a campaign in an area densely populated by Armenians, and he left the Central Army on 17 October. The Armenians welcomed Baldwin, and the local population massacred the Seljukes, capturing the fortresses of Rivendell and Turbasal before the end of 1097. Baldwin makes Bagrat the governor of Rivendell. Establishment of the First Crusader state. The Armenian Lord Thoros of Edessa sent envoys to Baldwin in early 1098, asking for his help against the nearby Seljukes. Before departing for Edessa, Baldwin ordered Bagrat's arrest for collaborating with the Seljukes. Bagrat was tortured, and Rivendell was forced to surrender. Baldwin left for Edessa in early February. En route, he was harassed by the forces of Balduk, Emir of Samosata. Arriving in the city, He was welcomed by both Thors and the local Christian population. Notably, Thors adopted Baldwin as a son, making him co-ruler of Edessa. Taking troops from Edessa with him, Baldwin raided Balduc's territory and established an outpost at a small fort near Samosata. Soon after Baldwin's return from the expedition, a group of local nobles began plotting against Thors, presumably with Baldwin's consent. Riots broke out in the town, forcing Thors to take refuge in the castle. Baldwin set out to rescue his adoptive father, but when rioters broke into the castle on March 9th and killed both Thors and his wife, he did nothing to stop them. The next day, after the townspeople recognized Baldwin as their ruler, he assumed the title of Count of Edessa, thus establishing the First Crusader state. Since Baldwin had little military power, he used diplomacy to secure his rule in Edessa. He married Arda of Armenia, who later became queen consort of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And encouraged his patrons to marry local women. The city's overflowing coffers enabled him to recruit mercenaries and buy Samosata from Balduc. The resulting treaty of the transfer of Samosata was the first friendly treaty between a Crusader leader and a Muslim ruler who served as governor of the city. An important figure in this Crusader kingdom in the 12th century was Belk Ghazi, the grandson of Artuk, the former Seljuk governor of Jerusalem. Belek was to play a small role in the story. As an aristocratic emir hired by Baldwin to suppress a rebellion in Sarojadai, when the Muslim leaders of the town approached Baldwin to rescue them, Baldwin quickly advanced towards Saroj, but it soon became apparent that his forces were unable to withstand the siege and the defenders surrendered to Baldwin. Baldwin demands that Balduc's wife and children be taken hostage, and upon his refusal, Baldwin captures and kills him. After the capture of Saroj, Baldwin was strengthened and secured his communication with the main command of the Crusaders. Carboga, always on the alert to defeat the Crusaders, gathered a large army to eliminate Baldwin. During his march to Antioch, Carboga laid siege to the walls of Edessa for 3 weeks in May, but was unable to capture it. This delay contributed to the Crusade victory at Antioch. Siege of Antioch. The Crusaders, without Baldwin and Tancred, had advanced towards Antioch. Between Constantinople and Jerusalem. A letter from Stephen of Blois described the city as very extensive, fortified with incredible strength, and almost impregnable. The idea of taking the city by assault was a disincentive to the Crusaders. Hoping to force the besiegers to surrender or find a traitor within the city, the Crusaders began the siege of Antioch on October 20th, 1097. The city was so large that the Crusaders did not have enough troops to besiege it completely, and consequently, it was only partially supplied. The subsequent siege of Antioch has been called the most interesting siege in history. By January, the 8-month siege resulted in hundreds, or possibly thousands, of Crusaders starving to death. Edmer believed that this was due to their sinful nature. Therefore, rituals of fasting, prayer, almsgiving, and processions were performed. Where given, women were expelled from the camp. In March, a small British fleet arrived with supplies. The Franks took great advantage of the dissension and disorder in the Muslim world. Instead of uniting their forces and fighting in December and February, the Seljuk brothers, Dakak of Syria and Rizwan of Aleppo, sent separate relief forces to Antioch, which they easily routed. After these setbacks, Karboga formed a coalition of southern Syria, northern Iraq, and Anatolia with ambitions of extending his power from Syria to the Mediterranean. Instead of turning on Antioch, the coalition spent the first 3 weeks trying to recapture Saroj, which proved to be a decisive delay for the fall of Antioch. Bohemond convinced the other leaders that, if Antioch was captured, he would hold it and a section along the city walls. The Armenian commander agreed to allow the Crusaders to enter. Finally, the traitor was found. An Armenian pharaoh helped Bohemond enter the city with a small military contingent on June 2 and open one gate. At this point, horns were blown. And the Christian majority of the city opened other gates. Nicaea and the Crusaders entered the city and massacred the Muslim population, as well as many Christians, Greeks, Syrians, and Armenians. In June, the vanguard of Karboga's 40,000-strong army arrived at Antioch to besiege the Franks. For 4 days from 10 June, the troops of Karboga's men attacked the city walls from dawn to dusk. Bohemond and Adhemar successfully defended the massive ramparts and gates. Karboga then changed tactics to try to starve the Crusaders. Morale within the city was low and defeat seemed imminent. On 24 June, the Franks demanded terms for surrender, which were rejected. At dawn on June 28, 1098, while the Muslims were engaged in prayer, the Franks led 4 war bands out of the city. Karboga allowed them to line up in the open. However, the discipline of the Muslim army could not be maintained, and a random attack was launched. The result: the Muslim army failed and retreated with very few casualties. Stephen Alexander of Blues was in Rydada. When he learned of Antioch's desperate situation, he left the Middle East, returning to France to warn the Roman Emperor Alexius and his army. Because of what looked like a massive betrayal, the leaders of Antioch, especially Bohemond, argued that Alexius had abandoned the crusade and thus invalidated all his oaths. Further discord arose when Bohemond asserted his claim to Antioch, which was not agreed upon by all, especially Raymond of Toulouse. Therefore, the crusade was postponed until the following year. In discussing this conclusion and disagreement, a common historical perspective has been proposed by some scholars that the Franks of northern France, the Provençals of southern France, and the Normans of southern Italy considered themselves separate nations, while everyone tried to create a ruckus. While others argue that, apart from these conflicts, the personal ambitions of the Crusader leaders and the establishment of their own kingdoms were the biggest problems in the path of victory. Meanwhile, a plague broke out, killing many in the army, including the legate Adhemar, who died on 1 August. There were fewer horses than before, and to make matters worse, the Muslim farmers of the area refused to supply the Crusaders with food. Thus, in December, after the siege of Marat al-Numan, some historians describe the first instance of cannibalism among the Crusaders. At the same time, the rank-and-file commanders and soldiers became restless and threatened to march on Jerusalem without their quarreling leaders. Finally, at the beginning of 1099, the marches resumed, leaving Bohemond behind as the first prince of Antioch. From Antioch to Jerusalem. Advancing up the Mediterranean coast, the Crusaders encountered little resistance. As the local rulers preferred to make peace with them and supply them with supplies rather than fight. With their armies ready, Robert Curthose and Tancred agreed to become vassals of Raymond IV of Toulouse, who was wealthy enough to pay for their services. Was a supporter of Baldwin, refused to do so. In January, Raymond pulled down the Marat al-Numan walls, and he marched south to Jerusalem, barefoot and in pilgrim's garb, followed by Robert and Tancred and their respective armies. Raymond planned to capture Tripoli to establish a state equal to Antioch, but first began the siege of Arca, a city in northern Lebanon, on 14 February 1099. Raymond then joined the rest of the Crusaders at Antioch and marched south in February. Bohemond had originally set out with them, but, sensing danger, hurried back to Antioch to consolidate his rule, while Tancred left Raymond's service and joined Godfrey. A separate army attached to Godfrey was led by Baron Kegstone IV Thor. Godfrey, Robert, Tancred, and Gaston reached Arca in March, but the siege continued. Dissensions among the war leaders were raging, not only among the military leaders, but also among the clergy. Since the death of Adhemar, the crusade had had no real leader. And since the discovery of the Holy Cross, on which Jesus was crucified, accusations of fraud began to circulate among clerical factions. The farmer, Peter Bartholomew, who claimed that St. Andrew had revealed to him in Antioch that this was the cross on which Jesus was hung, was burned on April 8 by Arnulf the Vigilante, challenged by trial. Peter went through the ordeal and died from his wounds after several days of agony, leading to the Holy Cross being declared a forgery. This also undermined Raymond's authority over the crusade, as he was the main supporter of the authenticity of the Holy Cross. The siege of Arca lasted until May 13th, but from here the Crusaders retreated in vain and achieved nothing. The Fatimids had recaptured Jerusalem from the Seljukes the year before and tried to make a deal with the Crusaders, allowing Christian pilgrims to visit the Holy Land on the condition that the Crusaders did not advance into their territory. Freedom was promised, but denied. The Fatimid Iftikhar al-Dawla was the governor of Jerusalem and was well aware of the Crusaders' intentions. So he drove out all the Christian inhabitants of Jerusalem. It also poisoned most of the wells in the area. On May 13th, the Crusaders arrived in Tripoli, where Amir Jalal ul-Mulk Abu al-Hassan provided the Crusaders with horses and pledged that if the Crusaders defeated the Fatimids, they would convert to Christianity. Moving south along the coast, the Crusaders passed through Beirut on May 19 and Tyre on May 23. Turning inland at Jaffa, on 3 June he reached Ramallah, which had been deserted by its inhabitants. Before moving to Jerusalem, the Bishop of Ramla was installed. In the Church of St. George, on June 6, Godfrey sent Tancred and Gaston to capture Bethlehem, where Tancred hoisted his banner over the Church of the Nativity. On June 7th, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. Many Crusaders wept at the sight of the city, which they had traveled so long to reach and had massacred so many innocent people and looted. Siege of Jerusalem. The arrival of the Crusaders in Jerusalem settled a barren countryside with no provision for water or food supplies. There was no prospect of relief, even as they feared an attack from the local Fatimid rulers. There was no hope of blockading the city as in Antioch. The Crusaders had insufficient troops, supplies, and time, as by the time the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, it is estimated that only 12,000 men remained, including 1,500 cavalry. Thus, the decisive siege of Jerusalem began. Godfrey and Tancred camped north of the city. Raymond camped south. Also, the provincial contingent did not participate in the initial attack on 13 June 1099. This first attack was probably intended to test the strength and resistance of the planned outer wall, which repulsed the Crusaders. After the failure of the initial attack, a meeting was held between the various leaders in which it was agreed that a more concerted attack would be needed in the future. On June 17th, a party of Genoese mariners under Guglielmo Umbriaco arrived at Jaffa and supplied the Crusaders with skilled engineers and, more importantly, timber to build siege bunkers by plundering the ships. The Crusaders' morale was boosted when the priest Peter Desiderius, who claimed to have had a divine vision of Lepio's resurrection, instructed them to fast and then march in barefoot procession around the city walls, which then the city will fall, like the biblical story of the Battle of Jericho. After 3 days of fasting, on July 8, the Crusaders marched, ending at the Mount of Olives, where Peter the Hermit gave them a passionate sermon, and soon after the various factions clashed. Soon after, news arrived that a Fatid relief force had left Egypt, giving the Crusaders a strong incentive to make another attack on the city. The final attack on Jerusalem began on July 13. Raymond's troops attacked the south gate, while others attacked the north wall. Initially, the provincials at the south gate made little progress, but the troops on the north wall fared better with a slow but steady movement of defense. On July 15th, a final push was made at both ends of the city, and finally, the inner wall of the northern wall was captured. In a panic, the defenders left both ends of the city walls bare, allowing the Crusaders to finally enter the city. The pogroms that followed the capture of Jerusalem have earned a reputation as a combination of extreme violence and furious faith. Eyewitness accounts from the Crusaders themselves leave no doubt that the siege was followed by a great massacre. According to Muslim historians, so much carnage was carried out that the horses' poisons were soaked in human blood. After a successful assault on the north wall, the defenders fled to the Temple Mount, pursued by Tancred and his men. Before the defenders could secure the area, Tancred's men stormed the area, killing many of the defenders. while the rest took refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Tancred then stopped the human slaughter by offering to take the people in the mosque under his protection. When the defenders of the south wall heard of the fall of the north wall, they rushed to the citadel and allowed Raymond and the provincials to enter the city. The commander of the garrison, Iftikhar al-Dawla, made a deal with Raymond, surrendering the fortress in exchange for safe passage to Escalon. For several days, these crusaders continued to slaughter the people of Crusaders without discrimination: children, old people, women, and men. Muslims were killed indiscriminately, and Jews who had taken refuge in their synagogue were also burned to ashes by the Crusaders. The next day, the prisoners Tancred had given in the mosque were also slaughtered. However, it is clear that some of the city's Muslims and Jews escaped the massacre, either escaping or being held captive for ransom. A letter from the Cretan elders of Ascalon gives details of the Jews of Ascalon, who were making great efforts to ransom Jewish captives and send them safely to Alexandria. The resident Christian population of the city had been evicted before the governor's siege and thus escaped the massacre. Establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. On July 22nd, a council was held in the church to establish governance for Jerusalem. The death of the Greek patriarch meant that there was no clear ecclesiastical candidate to establish religious supremacy. Although Raymond of Toulouse could claim to be the preeminent Crusader leader from before 1098, he lost support after unsuccessfully attempting to besiege Arca and build his own empire. Perhaps this is the reason why he refused to wear the Holy Crown. Godfrey was then elected leader, who assumed the title of Guardian of the Holy Sepulchre. Raymond, angered by this development, attempted to capture the Tower of David before leaving the city. Pope Urban II died on July 29, 1099, 14 days after the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, but before news of the event reached Rome. He was succeeded by Pope Paschal II, who served for nearly 20 years, while the monarchy of Jerusalem remained intact until 1291. The city of Jerusalem was recaptured by Saladin Ayyubi in 1187 AD as a result of the decisive Battle of Hattin. Battle of Escalon. In August 1099, the Fatimid Vizier Al-Afdal Emperor landed an army of 20,000 North Africans at Ascalon. Geoffrey and Raymond marched to meet this force at the Battle of Escalon on 9 August with a force of only 1,200 knights and 9,000 foot soldiers. Outnumbered 2-1, the Franks launched a surprise attack at dawn and defeated an overconfident and unprepared Muslim force. The opportunity was lost, however, as a feud between Raymond and Godfrey prevented the city's garrison from surrendering to the more reliable Raymond. The Crusaders won a decisive victory, but the city remained in Muslim hands, posing a military threat to the fledgling kingdom. Return and legacy. The majority of the Crusaders now considered their pilgrimage complete and returned home. Only 300 knights and 2,000-foot Crusaders were left to defend Palestine. It was the support of the Knights of Lorraine that enabled Godfrey to assume leadership of Jerusalem, contrary to Raymond's claims. When he died a year later, the same Lorraines thwarted the plans of Dagobert, the papal heir of Pisa, to make Jerusalem a theocracy, and instead made Baldwin the first Latin king of Jerusalem. Bohemond returned to Europe from Italy to fight the Byzantines, but was defeated at Dyrrhachium in 108. After Raymond's death, his heirs captured Tripoli in Athalmai with the help of the Genoese. Relations between the newly formed Crusader states of the County of Edessa and the Principality of Antioch were not good. They fought together in a crusade at the Battle of Haran in 1104. But the Antiochians claimed sovereignty and blocked Baldwin II's return to Jerusalem after being captured in battle. The Franks became deeply involved in the politics of the Middle East, as a result of which Muslims and Christians often fought each other. There were many Crusaders who returned home before reaching Jerusalem, and many who never left Europe, allowing the Crusaders to gain strength. When the success of the Crusades became known in Europe, they were mocked and taunted by their families and threatened with excommunication by the Pope. Was considered a co-hero. Robert II of Flanders was given the title Hierosolymitans for his exploits. There is written evidence of an Islamic response before 1160 CE. While the great powers of the Islamic world remained divided among rival rulers in Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and Baghdad, no pan-Islamic counteroffensive was launched. The story of the First Crusade and the main characters that caused this geopolitical shift came to a conclusion. Thus ends our conversation, which was about the First Crusade. You can also watch videos covering the Second Crusade, Third and Fourth Crusades on our channel.